as we move towards population health, and just all the reform that we're undergoing in healthcare, we've been talking about the need to actually learn how to manage wellness in a population as opposed to simply treating illness. And I want to talk about just exactly how do we measure wellness, particularly in a very diverse population like California, where we're getting a lot of racially ambiguous population. So how do we then track health disparities in this sort of a situation? Now I'm going to share with you some ongoing research that we're doing actually in conjunction with White Memorial Medical Center, the new Center for Hispanic Health. Okay, I'm a methodologist, I'm a researcher, so let's just review briefly the basics 1A of the scientific method. Oh, don't turn it off too much, I like to talk with people. Okay, so in science what we do is we conceptualize some pieces of the world that they relate to one another in some fashion, so we create a model, ideally to test an hypothesis. And then what we do is we predict. If my model works, I predict at the end of the experiment I will observe this. Then you actually run the experiment, you apply the data, and at the end, if what you expected to see and if what you actually see are very close together, you think, I got a model that maybe is worth something. However, if what you expected to see and what you actually observe are very different, you may need to go back to the drawing board. So let's put this model into play around the issue of metrics for population health. This is a report that was released just a year ago by the Institute of Medicine, Metrics That Matter for Population Health, and it was partially underwritten by the Robert Wood Johnson. This is the latest thinking, how to predict the health of a population. And they say, among other things, the primary drivers of poor health outcomes are race and poverty. Then go on to say health disparities exist across neighborhoods for a variety of reasons, including education and income. I think we're pretty familiar with this: race, poverty, education, access to care. And in fact, as we look at these determinants of health that we're working on, the social determinants of health, here in this particular model we have the innate individual traits: age, sex, race. So race keeps coming up as an important issue. Here, and this is a rather, you can see why I don't like this, but this is a model. A social inequity is race ethnicity. That's an inequity? Well, in this model, you know, right, for if you want to look at poor outcomes, yes. Okay. And the debates are far from dead. Just a couple of years ago, there was an article about how Latino ACT scores are lower than other groups, trailing whites. And one of the people interviewed said, race does play a factor in student achievement. It's not just an issue of class. So again, you got your class, your social determinants. So here's that innate characteristic, race. And he said, it's a conversation that's lacking. And this kind of reminds me, some of us remember the old bell-shaped curve from 1980. Okay, are we going back to that? Is this Arthur Jensen Redux? Okay, so here is the classic model on health disparities. African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian and Pacific Islander, and Hispanic citizens. Whew, you know, in this state, that's a whole bunch of folks. Suffer poorer health and higher rates of premature death than the majority population. I'm sure you've heard this many times and oft. Okay. And this is based on the risk factor model that if we're going to compare two populations in terms of race, low income, education, low access to care, let's say population A and B. A is racially non-white, low income, low education, low access to care. Population B is white, high income, high education, etc. Then population B will show higher incidence of adverse health outcomes, earlier mortality, more heart, more cancer, more stroke, higher infant mortality, more low birth weight babies, etc., etc. Sounds familiar, right? Well, let's test it.
Can I ask a question before?
Well,
why did you separate between race and ancestry?
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. So here are the top 10 causes of death in the United States. Number 1 cause of death is heart disease. Number 2 is cancer. Number 3 is chronic lower respiratory disease. Those 3 causes of death account for about 60% of all deaths in the United States. So let's look at the number one cause of death, which is heart disease. And we are going to compare Latino to non-Hispanic white. Now, which group has the higher risk factor? Which is the group, the not white, is Latino. Lower income, Latino. Lower education, Latino. Less access to care, Latino. Don't get me even started about the Latino physician shortage. Okay, so we have all of our data. Let's look at the outcomes, and here are the age-adjusted mortality rates. Okay, which group should have the more heart attacks? How many think, according to the model, it should be Latino? Just raise your hand if you read the model. It should be, right? And here are the data. Non-Hispanic white is 169.9 deaths per 100,000, age-adjusted. Latino is 30% lower. Nationally, 55 million people. Whoa. What happened to the model? Isn't it supposed to be about 200? It's lower, 30% lower. Okay, let's go to the number two cause of death, cancer. Which group has higher risk factors, non-Hispanic white or Latino? Latino. Which group by the model should have higher cancer mortality rate? Should be Latino. For non-Hispanic white, it's 166.2. Latino is 40% lower, 112.4. Is this surprising to anybody? The data have been around for 35 years. We haven't looked at them. Okay, number three cause of death, chronic lower respiratory disease. You know the drill. Which group has worse risk factors? Latino. Which group should have the higher death rate? Should be Latino. And the Latino rate is 60% lower. What did we predict? What did we see? Multiple standard deviations away. Okay, let's look at all causes of death, just in case there's something weird with those top three. You know the drill. Who has the worst risk factors? Latinos. Who should have the higher death rate for all causes of death? Should be Latino, and it's not. Non-Hispanic white, 742.8. Latinos, 523.3. 30% lower. And we see this year after year after year after year. Let's look at infant mortality. These are all national level data. From 1985 to 2010, this is non-Hispanic white infant mortality. Now, we know from the birth record that Latinos receive fewer prenatal visits. They're initiated later into the pregnancy. So which group should have the higher infant mortality? Add in race and income and all that. Should be Latino, right? And the actual curve is, they're identical. Even though the mothers live worlds apart in terms of age, income, education, access to care, and race, identical. And here we have 2013, identical. They tend to vary around. This is, it has a name, it's called the Latino epidemiological paradox. We first noticed it, well, I first noticed it here in California, and actually about the same, almost the same day, a colleague of mine was looking at Texas data in Galveston, and he actually wrote the paper first and gave it the name. That's Kyriakos Markitis. The Latino epidemiological paradox. It seems a paradox that in spite of low income, low education, low access to care, and being non-white, better health outcomes? Of course, as I look here, the largest single population in California is Latino, at almost 41%. I look at the babies, 52% of the babies are Latino. I say, it's not a paradox, that's now the norm. The problem is, we have never bothered to notice it or research it, because we were expecting to see something else. We got led astray by some perspective. And we get to life expectancy. We've been tracking this for quite a while. Latinos have 3-year longer life expectancy than non-Hispanic white. I turned 72 this year. Let me tell you, those 3 extra years are looking mighty good right now. Mighty good. Okay, so let's go back to this. African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian and Pacific Islander, and Hispanic citizens suffer poorer health and higher rates of premature death than the majority population. Guess what? The model does not work. Well, it just didn't work. And we have 35 years worth of data. state by state, national, you name it. Nonetheless, we still capture data by ethnicity, by race. We have white, black, Asian, Native American. Then we have that funny Hispanic thing. But I have to wonder, we're capturing something, apparently. And with Latinos, we're capturing something unexpected. But what exactly are we capturing? So let me just shift decks here. Okay, and let's talk about how we measure. You know, when we're doing health research, we're always trying to find things that can help us predict. So a lot of the variables we use, we understand, like education. That's usually years of education, or you can do high school graduation, college graduation. But however you go, you have education, various ways of doing it, but it's different from income. You would never put in dollars for years of education. You know, dollars down here in income, years of education is here. Occupation. So we have these very discrete, separate variables. And of course, we run our regressions to see what happens. So then, just as easily, we say, oh, let's regress against white, because we know who white is, black, Hispanic, and Asian. Just as if they were years of education. And you get results. But what are we measuring? Well, as I've been looking at it, and I'll take the blame for whatever follows, I think rather than measuring race, because in this country we seem to think there's something about the whiteness or the blackness or the Asianness that drives things. So we do our randomized clinical trials to test a medication on white and on blacks and on Asians, right? Because somehow there's something in that blackness or whiteness that makes the medication work differently. I would like to offer that perhaps we're not measuring race, we're measuring racial narratives, which is a little bit different from race. What do I mean by racial narrative? We'll stop and consider. When we operationalize these racial categories, actually up until the 1980 census, you were not asked in the census what race you were. The enumerator assigned you a race. Well, how did they do that? Here are the instructions for the 1930 census. A person of mixed white and Negro blood was to be returned as Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. The old one-drop rule. So all you need is one knowable black ancestor. You're black. You're all the way in that black category because they're binary, mutually exclusive. So this is the U.S. binary racial narrative. Ever since the 1980 census now, people have been able to offer. They can pick what their race is, and they're given choices. You can be white, or black, or African American, or American Indian, or Alaska Native, but you need to put in your tribe. Or you can be Asian Indian, or Chinese, or Filipino, or Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, or other Asian, but indicate Lao, Cambodian, Hmong. Or you can be Native Hawaiian, or Guamanian, or Chamorro, Samoan, other Pacific Islander, or some other race. Your residual category, some other race. Well, we have a very strong racial narrative in this country. As we look at the non-Hispanic population, people have got the drill after 200 years. They know what they're supposed to respond. So as we look at the non-Hispanics, 76% say they're white, 15% say they're black, 1% say they're Indian, 6% say they're Asian, 2/10 Pacific Islander, 2/10 say, I must be some other race. And 2.3% say, I'm two or more. These are really small percentages. They got the drill. They know the drill. So let's put this into operation. Let's look at the mothers and fathers of babies born in California in 2010. We're getting this off the master birth file. Let me explain this. You know, the census, they have really cumbersome terminology, right? So you can be a single race person. These are the babies in which, and this is all based on the mom, by the way. The mom is single race white, that's census terminology, right? and the father is also single race white. So that's 21% of the nearly 500,000 babies born in California. 4% were single race black, mom, single race black, dad. Almost 10% were single race Asian with single race Asian dad. 0.5% single race American Indian, mother, single race American Indian dad. And then 12% were a mother with one of these and a father with one of these. These would be mixed race. 12%, that's almost as big. Well, it's the second one after white, single race white. Okay, now let's get to the elephant in the room. Latino babies. Well, Latino moms. Okay, 52% of the babies born were born to a Latina mother. But what race are Latinos? I mean, if race makes a difference, you would think, well, actually, it shouldn't matter. You should put the white Latinos here and the black Latinos there and the Indians over here and the Asians over there. Just mix them in, because isn't race the operant thing, the most important thing that makes all the difference? Okay, let's look at Latinos in the U.S. racial narrative. You know, Latinos have befuddled the U.S. ever since 1848. What race were Latinos? And this is important in terms of citizenship, you know, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. These things were argued loudly at the California Constitutional Convention in 1849 in Monterey. And basically, the issue was punted. It was punted in the sense that the decision by the majority, not by the Latinos, was, well, we don't know what race you are, but a judge and a jury will know what race you are. No, literally, that's the way it wound up. A judge and a jury will know what race you are. Okay, by the 1930 census, actually Mexican was a separate race. So here we have 1930 census. We know how many whites there were, how many Negroes, how many Mexicans, Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. Here, the residual, all other. Now, how did someone get into this category? Let's look at the operationalizations. Instructions to the enumerator, 1930 census. Practically all Mexican laborers are of a racial mixture difficult to classify, though usually well recognized in the localities where they are found. Okay, so here's the 1930 census. Here's an enumerator. You know, it's got his checking things off, sees a guy out in the field, squints, can't quite make out this person, so he goes over to Billy Bob. Billy Bob, is that there Mexican? Yep, that's Mexican. Okay, Mexican. Were they operationalizing race or the local racial narrative? Okay. Well, things haven't gotten a whole bunch better, only now you get to pick what it is. So here's a 2010 definition. Hispanic, a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. Think you're going to do a randomized clinical trial. You want to put only Hispanics in your experimental category, only whites or only blacks in your control. Give me your exclusion and inclusion rules that will guarantee I have only Hispanics here and only whites there. Guess what? Can't do it. Oh, we're doing RCTs on Hispanics and blacks and whites because we think we know what we're doing. Okay, so in the censuses, first of all, people are asked, are you Hispanic? And you can say, no, I'm not. Okay, skip pattern to the next question. Or you can say, yes. Well, are you Mexican, Puerto Rican, or Cuban, or other Spanish, Hispanic, Latino? Print it out. Okay. So Latinos usually get this. Then, oh, by the way, what race are you? Okay, and most Latinos have the difficulty. Well, where's the Latino? Oh, that's not a race. What do you mean it's not a race? But these, okay. So here is the response pattern nationally, Latinos to the question on race. 53% said they were white. 2.5% said they're black. 0.5% said they're Asian. 1.5% said they're American Indian. 37% said I must be some other. And 6% said, well, clearly, mestizo or two or more races. Okay, and race drives things, right? What is race? Now, why are Latinos so confused by the U.S. racial categories? Well, the confusion started the day after October 11th, 1492. On October 11th, 1492, not one single Indian lived in the Western Hemisphere. Not one. Oh, you had about 250 million people. They weren't Indians. They were Tzeltal, they were Purépecha, they were Otomí, they were Mapuche. They were not Indians. Oh, but October 12th, 1492, Columbus is sailing to India. He hits land. I'm in India. So he gets off. So you guys are Indians, and we've been having complications ever since. I mean, everything got started off on the wrong foot. So yes, there's an indigenous substrate, and it took Indians hundreds of years to learn that they were Indians. Hundreds of years, okay. But on top of that, then, you had huge African immigration, and all over Latin America. And now in Latin America, they're beginning to understand maybe we need to find out who is of African origin. So in Mexico, is it Prieto, Negro, Moreno? Or how do you say African American in Spanish? Peru. For peace sake, Argentina, right? Un pedazo de Europa in America Latina, not so European. In the 1825 census of Buenos Aires, there were more African origin than Europeans in Buenos Aires. Okay. Then Asian. Oh, we forgot Asian. The treasure fleet, however, starting in 1565, left Acapulco, hit Manila, came back along the Pacific Current. And for the next 300 years, you had people all over from Asia, from China, India, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines. They did have to be Christians. That was the one. I mean, they just couldn't come aboard as long as they were Christians. And so you had communities of Chinese. You had communities of Filipinos all over Latin America. Well, come on. The presidential candidate last time, Keiko Fujimori, although she was more recent. Osorio Chong, you know, the Minister of Finance in Mexico. So you get people from Asia as well. And you get Iberian Europeans, which tended to have a healthy representation of Jewish and of Muslim. You can remember both Jews and the Muslims were kicked out of Spain in 1492, and a lot of them found refuge in the Western Hemisphere. So stir this all around for 500 years, and you get mestizos, and you get mulattos. And in fact, the colonial Spanish had 16 different categories to put you in, depending on what proportion of Indo, Afro, Oriento, Ibero you might happen to be. And this is my term for it. Well, you say Spanish America, that leaves out Brazil, right? Or you say Latin America, it's like, well, it's only just the Europeans that spoke Latinate languages. Let's not forget the Indo, let's not forget the Afro, let's not forget the Oriental and the Ibero. And it's a very, very fun mix. But coming out of Latin America, it created its own racial narrative, but it's different from the US binary racial narrative. Nonetheless, here, we're trying to stick Latinos into this binary racial narrative. So in this particular sample, they have so many white non-Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, Asian non-Hispanic, then Hispanic regardless of race. But wait, if we're trying to measure race, and then we have this group that's not a race, and we're going to compare, it's like suddenly measuring education in dollars. I mean, there's an epistemological problem here. We've really mixed up our categories. The 1,000 Genomes Project has been doing work all around Latin America. And they did 3 samples here in one of their first papers in Colombia, Medellin, Puerto Rico, and Islos, Aztlán. And here they're estimating proportion of European, West African, Native American in these 3 areas. And you will notice on each one of these columns is an individual. Everybody's got some Native American, everybody's got some European, and everybody's got some West African. Everybody. So by the one-drop rule that gets U.S. citizens into that black column, shouldn't all Latinos be in the black column? But were black health outcomes the same as Latino? Let's take a look at this. But let's finish this, the racially ambiguous babies. Okay, so here we are so we have white, black, Asian, Indian, mixed, Latino. Where do they fit? Well, to begin with, remember we're talking about a base of almost 500,000, almost 500,000 babies. De plano, 10% of the babies in California were to a Latina mom, but the father was either non-Hispanic, white, black, Asian, or American Indian, which also then would make them mixed. So we can put them up here. Suddenly you have more racially ambiguous babies than white. But then, what race are the remaining Latinos? Well, if we apply the proportions that Latinos responded to the question on race, assuming, and this is actually not going to bear out, but assuming white Latino down here, black Latino, Asian Latino, Indian Latino, and it's not going to be that easy, but let's just assume. You see how all of these are some other Latino with another some other Latino, like I don't know what race I am. Okay, so let's put these some other race here. Because remember, we're looking at race and health outcomes. The largest single group of babies are racially ambiguous. So what are we going to do with them? Well, what we have been doing at the national level is we exclude those some other and 2+ races. Because in the non-Hispanic, people they know what they're supposed to answer. That's not very much. And so you'll typically see this in national surveys. Okay, participant race is coded to 1 of 5 categories: white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and other. Because the other category was small and not always identifiable, these participants were not included in the analysis. You exclude them. Well, when it's 1% of a sample, you can probably get away with that. When it's 41%, we're just going to exclude them. What happened to your internal validity of the remaining? You have none. Suddenly we just blew out the internal validity. Or can we substitute social determinants? Well, let's take a look at this. Will social determinants make race unnecessary? Okay, remember what IOM said, the primary drivers of poor health are race, poverty, income, education. Let's look at low birth weight in Los Angeles County and some of the social determinants. So, as we look at education, and this did not graduate from high school, 6% of white, 11% of black, 44% of Latinos did not graduate from high school. 4 times that of black, 6 times that of white. As we look at adults without health insurance, 11% of white, 17% of black, 31% of Latino. In poverty, 9% of white, 9.7, 19.9, 19.2 of Latino, fairly similar. What are the effects on low birth weight? Well, we see a very clear gradient between white and black, but with Latino, actually, it's that Latino epidemiological paradox again. Remember, by the one-drop rule in the U.S. racial binary, all of these could be included here, and then what have we just done to the U.S.-born African-American health outcome? We just occluded it. So the race categories are ambiguous, and then we have this big chunk of overtly racially ambiguous babies, but the outcomes are not ambiguous. We've been following them as we look at heart disease. This is California data, and these are in the new edition, La Nueva California. This is non-Hispanic white. Latino is about 30% lower. Black is about 30% higher. Cancer, Latino is about 40% lower. Black's about 40% higher. Stroke, over and over. So clearly, even though these categories aren't race as we thought we knew, something is going on. Something is going on. And we're picking this up. We are attributing it almost to, well, it's their genes. It's their race. Is it? Here's all causes of death, age adjusted. So you can see the stability. This is African American from 1999 to 2013. This is non-Hispanic white. This is Latino, that crazy epidemiological paradigm. I mean, really stable, really different, but is it race? And here is infant mortality. We have all 40 years of data. This is African American infant mortality. And again, white and Latino basically vary around one another for 40 years. Life expectancy at birth, a little bit better here in California, 3.5 years. African Americans, substantially lower. But I don't think it's genetic. Okay, so here's where we have an issue. How do we measure wellness, or much less illness, in a racially ambiguous population? Because race alone, particularly when we include the racially ambiguous, they have no predictive power. But the standard social determinants, also with Latinos, have no predictive power. Where do we go from here? Well, let me just show you a little bit about current vestiges of the Indo-Afro-Ibero-Oriento-American racial narrative. That was actually here before the US binary racial narrative. The Latino pre-medical group at UCLA, Chicanos for Community Medicine. These are just the officers of the Latino Student Health Project. I mean, just by random, al azar, they got elected. But we can see the faces of Indo, Afro, Oriento, Ibero, America. They're all Latinas. They're all officers of CCM. And as you look at Latino populations, you can see the faces. You know, I always say when a Latino baby pops out, you never know what color the skin's going to be like. You never know the color of their eyes. You don't know what the hair is going to be like. You never know. It could be anything. Let me also give you one more rastro. I wasn't going to do this, but we had a little coffee hour before. Because sometimes we tend to think, well, that Latin American racial narrative, it's no longer here. It's not even here. Yes, we need to look at it. So I'm going to play a little video for you that can maybe shed some light. No, I might have to pull this up again. Okay. Cinco de Mayo is the most popular Latino celebration in the United States. Every year, millions of people celebrate it in venues ranging from small grammar school dances to large commercial fiestas. Yet, in Mexico, the Cinco de Mayo is not widely celebrated as it is in the U.S. So the question is, why is the Cinco de Mayo so widely celebrated in the U.S. when it is not in Mexico? The answer is that the public celebration of Cinco de Mayo was created by Latinos living in the American West, California, Nevada, and Oregon during the dark days of the American Civil War. Wait a minute. Latinos in the American Civil War? What is that all about? During the American Civil War, many Spanish language newspapers were published in California. In Los Angeles, El Amigo del Pueblo. And, for example, in San Francisco, El Eco del Pacífico. We can read these Spanish language newspapers today, and we can hear Latino voices speaking to us from 150 years ago. At times, the voices tell us about Latino daily life, restaurants serving Mexican food, musicians to provide tunes, musical and theatrical performances, births of the next generation, weddings, and deaths. We also hear the voices of Latinos concerned about policy issues that were tearing the United States apart, like slavery and race. When the American Civil War erupted, Latinos supported Abraham Lincoln and the United States against the Confederate slave states who wanted to create a new nation built upon forced labor held in chains. Latinos took up arms against the slave states. Major Jose Ramon Pico organized 4 troops of Spanish-speaking first armed encounter of the Civil War, the slave states rode a streak of luck, winning battle after battle, while the Spanish-language newspapers informed Latino readers of defeat after defeat for the United States Army. And then things got worse. Taking advantage of Lincoln's preoccupation with the Civil War, Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, sent his troops marching towards Mexico City to overthrow the constitutional republic headed by President Benito Juarez and install Maximilian of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico, who would then be free to cooperate with the slave states in the rebellion against the United States. But the French troops were stopped dead at the Battle of Puebla, fought on Cinco de Mayo of 1862, and could not reach Mexico City to create a slave state friend south of the border. In California, Nevada, and Oregon, Latinos read the news of the unexpected victory of Cinco de Mayo and immediately began celebrating this first major victory with the Latino music and dances of the American Civil War. And you will notice they did not use mariachi music for the simple reason that mariachis had not yet been invented. And they did not have dancing adelitas, as those were to be the symbols of the 20th century Mexican Revolution. Every Cinco de Mayo during the Civil War, Latinos in the American West would gather in great crowds to hear speeches.
On this great day of Cinco de Mayo, we remember the power of hope, the power of the people to overcome great odds. And we remember, we've won in the past, and we will win again.
They would march in huge parades.
Today, we band together to join our brothers and sisters in the fight.
Speakers would remind Latinos that they were struggling against both the slave states and their potential ally, the Emperor of the French, Napoleon III.
We unite to raise money, people, and any other resources we can spend for Mexico's fight for independence.
After the parades and speeches, Latinos gathered in meeting halls and in private houses to renew their energies to stop the slave states and the French in Mexico, using the music and steps they were familiar with. We at UCLA invite you to learn more about the American Civil War origins of the Cinco de Mayo in California, Nevada, and Oregon. We invite you to read about the Declaration of Independence in Spanish, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves in the rebelling states, the shocking assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and the final surrender of the slave states without their slaves. And that should be seen as yet more evidence of the Indo-Afro-Oriento-Ibero-American racial narrative that has always been here in California, which is why to this day Latinos just can't figure out what race they were. I was sharing when we had coffee beforehand the census for the 1980 census, the first time they used that Hispanic category. And I was on an advisory committee in the late 70s to give them some advice about doing this, and we kept telling them, you're doing this incorrectly. It's okay. They never listened. So they did the 1980 census. And I remember about 7 or 8 months afterwards, they got the first SF1 returns. And so they asked us to come back and help them understand the response patterns. And I remember this one bureaucrat from the Bureau of the Census came up to the podium, and he had all these papers in his hand. He said, do you realize in the 1980 census, half of Hispanics failed to answer correctly the question on race? We failed to answer. Well, he was assuming that the U.S. binary racial narrative flows around the world, and it doesn't. There are alternative racial narratives. So with that, I think I will open it up. Let's just chat a little bit. And if you want, I've got some thoughts about where, at least our project, where we're going. Basically, realizing that racially ambiguous is the largest category of babies. Okay, there they are. And on top of that, millennials are increasingly reluctant to identify themselves by race. So if we're going to do, as our only variable, look at health disparities by race, and you're going to have maybe half the population saying, that's not me, how do we measure disparity? It doesn't mean we're going to be a post-race society at all, by the way. Not at all. But just our standard measures are not going to give us the information that we need to track disparities and wellness. And here are the young millennials. So what our project is, we want to develop metrics that will measure disparities and predict health outcomes without using the race ethnic categories as we have known them and loved them. And we think we can do that by better understanding the effects of the U.S. racial narrative on health and community agency in contesting that racial narrative. I think we can operationalize that, and maybe that's what we need to be measuring, the effects of the narrative, not the so-called genetic, the gene pools in each of these groups, because we're going to be too mestizo to even use that by the 2030 census. So with that, thoughts, questions?
Does diet have something to do with it?
Does what?
Diet.
Well,
In
you,
in the sense of people coming from Europe, there was no pork in the Americas. You could choose pork. Same thing with
and cows.
Indians, I'm just saying,
Well, let's put it like this. I think these are questions we need to put on the table. What explains the Latino epidemiological pattern? I'm a researcher. When I see that what we observe is so different from the expected, and it's stable year after year after year now for 55 million people, this is not random variation. We need to understand there are mechanisms, but just not the ones we have been looking at. So I would say, yeah, let's look at diet. Let's look at spirituality. Let's look at family. Let's look at dancing, Who knows? There has to be some rational explanation. And I've done the numbers, by the way. If everyone had the same epidemiological profile as Latinos for heart, cancer, and chronic lower respiratory disease, we would save over 200,000 lives every year. And we wouldn't need a new bill in Congress. We wouldn't need to build new insurers. Just whatever Latinos are doing, if they could just share it with their neighbors. But we need to know what it is. What is it? Do you know anybody doing any research on this? No. That's the strength of the U.S. binary racial. We know it's got to be these things. Unlax. There are other racial narratives. Bring them in. This is the beauty of having diversity in the research lab. We need to understand there are other ways of putting this world together. And it's not just for affirmative action or to make it look pretty. We need to bring these different racial narratives in and understand how they influence health. So, yeah, let's look at it. And if you can't name anybody researching this, and by the way, by the time you add in Latino, African American, Asian, American Indian, that's 75% of the state's population. This is not a minority issue. This is the state. Yes, gentleman in the back. How did we forget Cinco de Mayo? We did. In fact, the book on Cinco de Mayo, I talk primarily about it, but it ends about 1869. My next book, or one of my future books, is How Did We Forget? Yes? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's not about beer. It's about civil rights in its origin, but that history has been lost. I didn't know. Until the answer just fell out, and I was doing some demographic epidemiological work in the 19th century, plopped out on my lap. Yes? It is, but the Midwest, because the Latino population, I was I'm going to Arkansas in about 2 weeks, and so I checked it out. It's 1.5% Latino, and primarily about 3 or 4 cities. So it'll probably, but in Arkansas, what it would look like is, oh, they're intermarrying and assimilating. Okay, it's not what it is, but that's the way it's interpreted, again, in the U.S. binary racial narrative. Here, just the size effects are so huge that I think we really got to say, okay, something new is happening here. And it goes way beyond the U.S. binary racial narrative. It's built on part on the Indo-Afro-Oriento-Ibero-American racial narrative, but we have other things we can add in there too, the African-American racial narrative within the U.S., which is very different from the binary. I think we really need diversity doing the research for population health. Yes.
What components of the racial narrative are you considering at this point in terms of?
Okay. You want to know? These are just my thoughts, and I'm actually, the thoughts, I'm trying to operationalize them yet so I can measure them. I haven't got them operationalized yet. Okay, and this, once again, let me give credit to White Memorial Medical Center for funding this research, or else we wouldn't be this far. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. I don't want to try to measure race anymore, but I do want to look at racial narratives and the effect of racial narratives. So I'm thinking, and this is just blue sky, and we can go out and have a glass of wine tonight and talk about it, because this is just the thinking. Okay, I think I see right now 3 domains of racial narrative. For example, there is foundational state violence. In order for this country to become the country that it is, certain groups at the founding had to suffer a really unique kind of violence for this country to be what it is. American Indians. The land was taken. African Americans. Labor was taken. And particularly Mexican and Puerto Rican, Latinos, hello, we invaded a sister republic. And in trying to swallow us because we stood up for abolition of slavery and racial equality, we damn near caused the Civil War in 1850. And today, in the racial narrative, it's not Latinos in general, it is Mexican. Mexican, Mexican, Mexican. Trump never talks about Puerto Ricans, never talks about, actually he's going to get a Cuban in his cabinet. Oh, we have a Latino. Yeah, but you know, he kind of doesn't know the racial narrative. So there are, in particular, these 3 groups just, if they hadn't suffered that violence, the U.S. would not be what it is, and they seem to have, like, in particular, just really upset the U.S. I think maybe it's guilt, I don't know. Okay, then you get state aggression. You know, the U.S. and Central America, why are the Salvadorans here? Because we were there. Why are the Guatemaltecos here, Nicaraguans? Because we were there, for Pete's sake. We mucks around the world. Why do you have Vietnamese here? Because we were in Vietnam. You know, wherever the soldiers go, we tend to get immigration from there. Now, it wasn't, the U.S. would still have been what it was if they hadn't mucked around the world, but they did. But it wasn't foundational, but clearly it was state aggression. Then a third level is state discrimination. There was an article in the LA Times, an exhibit that's opening up in the Japanese internment. Yeah, state aggression, for Pete's sake. We kicked the Chinese out of California in 1878. Discrimination laws. It's discrimination, you know, segregation. A little bit different from state aggression, really different from the foundational state violence. And some folks get all 3 of these. Well, my hunch is, I mean, for example, because I work with some folks from Charles Drew University. And we've been having some great conversations because at Charles Drew University, most of their quote-unquote black students are the children of immigrants from Nigeria. Well, the parents are very well educated. They're very wealthy. Now, the thing is, as they walk down the streets, your average person in the White House is not going to make any distinction between them and somebody who's been here for 10 generations. Yet, they come out of different narratives. Eventually, the Nigerian narrative will learn, well, usually the kids born here will start to understand, you know, the African-American narrative, but it takes a couple of generations. But meanwhile, what I'm hearing from my colleagues at Drew, but we grew up in the narrative. We can't even get to our own school. We founded it because we don't have the grades, because we're still kind of suffering the after effects. And we've had this thing with Latinos and with immigrants and U.S. born and everything else, trying to figure out how we fit together. So anyway, what I'm trying to do, and not all my colleagues want to go down this pathway, I'm trying to figure out how do I operationalize these to look at the effects of the racial narrative on these health outcomes. And understanding also there's community agency, because the community don't just sit there and take it and get, they come back, they do stuff. And we look at Latino epidemiological paradigm, wow, they're doing something. How do they find the tools to do that? Because again, the outcomes are not ambiguous. Not at all. Sorry, getting kind of deep here. But. Yes?
So I'm sort of wondering what your opinion then is on the method of using like someone's zip code as a health determinant, right?
Oh, God, don't get me started on that. I know they do it. Endowment does it all the time. Tell me your zip code, I'll tell you when you die, right?
Something that's sort of like reinforced in some of our departments here, and so like this is a good question to sort of ask. Like,
I'll ask it. Because it depends who's in that zip code. And as we see for Latinos, it doesn't matter their income or education or anything else. And this Latino thing is screwy. You can't define it in a scientific, but it has something. There's something going on. Okay, so, and you know, I've been doing zip code analysis for 50 years, but for the past 30 years, I've been really suspicious of it because you need to understand who's in that zip code. When we had the Rodney King uprising in 1992, we pulled together a group called the Latino Coalition for New LA, and the 1990 census had just been released, and I walked them census tract by census tract through South Central. And we could see, living in the same block would be Latino immigrants and African American. They just had really different profiles. Now you could put them together and just say, here's the zip code. You would miss, well, but what are the needs of the African American community? What are the needs of the Latino immigrant? You would not see it. So I do not believe in zip code. I do not believe in income, education, zip code, or race determinants having any predictive power. We're in the middle of doing our linear regressions. We're going to have a paper out, I hope, we're going to be submitting by the end of summer. And they have no predictive power. If they have no predictive power, why do we use them? Because we always use them, right? Yes, gentlemen.
To speak to that point, you make a convincing case that those kinds of things, and you might want to add exposure discrimination to that list, because that would also be much higher for groups that are in the Latino group. I don't think you want to say that those aren't important for health. I think you want to say that they're not important for explaining the differences that you so clearly show. I don't think you should say they're not predictive. They're strongly predictive.
Well, but
you get exposed to discrimination, you get excluded, and it's not good.
Sure. No, we've been doing a lot of work on the post-millennials, and that's part of the subtitle, Latinos from Pioneers to Post-Millennials, born since 1997. Very different from their parents, very different from non-Hispanic white post-millennials. But ever since the day they were born, they have had a target painted on their back every single day, and they've had to deal with it. And I hear about it. Let me tell you, yeah, that's got to have an effect. I don't know how we can measure it yet, but it's got to have an effect. Wow, they've survived this long. Yes, young lady.
Thank you for all of your analysis that you have, that you presented to us. One of my questions is, you specifically said that you looked at kind of this East LA Mexican ancestry. Well, one of my
I didn't. That's from Stanford. This is the 1,000 Genomes Project.
Okay.
It's not mine.
Okay. So, well, one of my questions is also thinking into that is looking at, particularly when we say that particular zip code, right? That's a historically mestizo Mexican area. In thinking of the time range that you're looking at, and if we're even talking about South Central, what we're seeing within the last 3 decades, so 30 years, is an immigration influx of indigenous migrants that are coming to this location. And one of the reasons why I wonder to think about as adding into this point or taking into consideration inter-ethnic discrimination, because when we start looking outside of East LA, you see that indigenous communities from southern Mexico and Central America have gone to Koreatown, Mid-City, or even all the way towards Compton. So that's kind of like a conversation time to think about where the different locations that quote-unquote Latinos but are indigenous communities are residing, but also the erasure of looking at that.
Absolutely. And what I've discovered working around Drew, because the demographics have shifted rapidly. When it was founded in Watts in 1971, it was a historically black college and university within a black area, Watts. Although, originally that was Rancho Tahuata Latino. Then it became white after segregation in World War I, up through the end of World War II, or to the beginning of World War II, and then because of the defense industry, we pulled out black migrants from the South. They needed to stay somewhere, so LA segregated Watts so that black workers in the defense industry could stay there, and now it's back almost totally Latino. That's when I look at the historic demographic, well, you came 180 degrees, but every group has always fought, this group's coming in, they're taking my place away. But when we can understand, particularly from the Indo-Afro-Oriento Ibero, we share a hell of a lot more than separates us. But if we don't know that, that's when we see this. I mean, we did some work for the Archdiocese about 20 years ago in South Central, where black parishes were suddenly becoming Spanish-speaking. And you would think, we go to the same church, we take the same communion, pray to the same God, why are we fighting? But they were having just, people complaining, why are they doing, taking away my parish, now doing Mass in Spanish. So we had to do some work there just to understand what's going on within the same church. So yes, it's easy to make divisions. But I like to look at what pulls it. I'm a lumper, not a splitter. I like to say, what do we have in common? Another question.
So, okay. So then what about the ways that like post-millennial people are now using these binary categories for their own social justice movements, right? So we do have Black Lives Matter, right? And then we have Latinos supporting Black Lives Matter.
Why not?
All that other stuff. So, no, but then how would this fit with your newer or like...
I don't know. Let's work on this. These are just ideas. I can't even operationalize. I can't even measure these yet, and they might turn out, once I do my modeling and I test them, could be wrong. It could be something else going on. Let's work on this together, yes.
So I'm making attempts, and I know others who are making attempts to do precisely this. I just emailed you my survey instrument that we filled in 2015. So I like what you're saying here, but I want to sort of like I agree with what Bruce was saying that I'm not so certain that we should entirely abandon this idea of or the effort to measure something related to race. I may
Well, I say the narrative is related to race.
Right, and to that, like when I saw the models that were presented and some of the evidence that you put up before where people kept saying race comes up, but every time I see that, I think, I'm certain someone of privilege put that up. Because when I put those kinds of models up, I think racism, like that's the like concept that's where the rub is at. It's not in the categorization of peoples. It's in the treatment and experiences that are accorded to individuals on the basis
Could be this.
of this categorization.
Let's work. We're right at the cusp of a whole new frontier of medical research. But we got to get away from the categories as we knew them and understand what is going on that gives us this outcome.
And sort of just as a final note, like I didn't see any attention to the role that newcomers play in what you termed the epidemiological paradox of Latinos.
Oh, to make a long story short, actually, when we disaggregate each one of those, immigrants have even less education compared to U.S.-born, less income, less access to care, and they have even fewer heart attacks, fewer cancer, fewer stroke, lower infant mortality, smoke less, drink less, do drugs less, work harder, work more hours per week, and have the highest poverty rate.
Didn't grow up in discrimination.
Well, they have something that seems to protect them, but that's what we need to find out. Yeah, Carl.
You seem to be going actually the opposite direction the Census Bureau is going.
Absolutely.
Could you comment on the current proposal to get rid of question 5, the Hispanic question, and actually create new Latino race?
Well, we did that in 1930.
Yeah.
Okay, so we keep coming back. But,
Census Bureau's considering doing
yeah, like again, we are not in a post-race world, that is for sure, okay? And yet it's not clear exactly what race, we know what racialization is. So as this Nigerian immigrant, full of privilege, and somebody from the hood walk down the street, they're going to get treated alike by most police departments, okay? So we're not post-race, and yet to say that the Nigerian has the same narrative as the brother from the hood, that's probably not correct either. I mean, we're just busting through. I haven't got all the answers. I don't even have the questions yet. There's just some of mine. Let's work on this together. You're in a perfect demographic here in Riverside County. Absolutely perfect. This is the future of the United States. Didn't mean to get heavy on you, but it's an opportunity, yes.
So I have two questions. So the first was, you're saying race as measured in the census is basically worthless.
It's not scientific. I was stopping to look at some real epistemological problems.
So my reaction to that was, your slide on DNA was really interesting.
Yeah, wasn't it though?
So maybe what we need is not to throw out race as a category, but to have individual DNA for
Well,
more accurate, not single, but multi-category descriptions of individual racial components.
well, when I was at this conference on race, ethnicity, and genomic and biomedical research, my seatmate was the gal who runs 23andMe. And she asked if I had noticed in their advertising 4 or 5 years ago, well, I'm part black and part white and part Indian. They don't say that anymore. Oh, from North America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, because all you know, it came from that region. So they're kind of ahead.
Yeah, so, within 10 years, it may be, you breathe on something and you get a DNA characterization of the
But then we also need to somehow link it up to this too, I think.
So maybe it's that we need a better measure of the biological component.
Well, but this is social as well. Yeah, but maybe getting the two together. I don't have answers. I barely have questions. Weak, but we're smarter together than we are individually. We can figure this out. Yes.
I would say that, so you're talking about racial narrative, but I would say there'd be a lot of value in developing these types of, particularly state discrimination in such a broad way that as state discrimination, the narrative of that evolves, like for religious groups, for example, currently, like that would be useful. I mean, I just, like, I know race, we're speaking to race here today and to one group, but I just think the value of being broad, because I think what we're all coming back to is discrimination or something like that.
Racial narratives again.
And not even racial, but like it's religious. Like
They tend to get really confounded. With the nativists, you have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, English speaking to be in America. They're very specific.
I just think there could be value in
Yeah.
keeping it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hey, this is good. This is like a seminar. Yes. I'm sorry? All right.
One part that stood out to me was Latino civil
Society at.
When does that begin? Does it begin in contact?
Oh. Well, actually, as I point out, what you wanted, I don't use the term racial group or ethnic enclave to talk about Latino. I talk about Latino civil society. Okay. As I wrote, in fact, that earlier book, this book, oops, let me get my cover up. This new book is the one I wanted to write, but I didn't know enough. I hadn't done enough research. I didn't understand the historic dimensions of all of this. I've done a deep dive into California history. That's why we got the Cinco de Mayo book. My next book coming out is a diary of a Mexican 49er who came to California 7 months after California had ceased being part of Mexico. So I'm understanding now the history of all of that. In fact, when I finished that first edition, I wondered, I thought, I was born here in California. I went to school. I know when the Spanish got here. When did the Mexicans get here and how? I didn't know. Well, now I know, and that's going to be a future book. So yes, it was a multiracial group, Indians, Africans, Asians, and a couple of Spaniards, Disque, and their mestizo, mulatto, and everything else, kids, brought Western society to California. It wasn't the Spanish, you think, the conquistadores on the caballo. They were humble, starved-out farmers from Sinaloa, Culiacan, walked all the way up here to start a new life. They were so starved out, they were willing to travel 1,000 miles to unknown territory, bringing Western civilization as they knew it, not as the courts of Madrid knew it, as they knew it, as a very, very mixed race. And that was the foundation of Latino civil society in California. Yes?
Well, we have a statue of Pienza here, in Riverside, for Spanish, supposedly. They came through area, but I live in a community called Casablanca, and it's
Oh, that has an interesting history.
yeah. I don't know if you know about that, but we've celebrated Cinco de Mayo for over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even before, and I like your history that you gave to me. That was
That's why. And
I love it. You know, yeah.
get the book. It gives you the whole history. But then the next book is, how did we forget? And I don't think it was an accident, but man, we've forgotten. In fact, I work with the Marquez Reyes family, and they owned Rancho Boca de Santa Monica. They're descendants of the 1769 group that got here, the charter group. And their families were involved in setting up Cinco de Mayo in Los Angeles in 1862, and that history had gotten lost in their own family. It got erased in their own family. And they love it when I brought it back. And I said, look, see what you guys did? So, yeah. So I didn't know any of this history. Now I know it. This is the book I wanted to write 10 years ago. So with that, I think, are we running late? Yes, can I turn it back to you?